Welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast, helping people take their leadership to the next level. Brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International.
Well, Richard, it's good to see you again.
Well, thanks, Sam. Good to see you.
Excellent, excellent. Well, this is one of the podcast series that we get a lot of feedback on, and I know a lot of people appreciate what we do when we go through leadership book reviews.
Yeah.
And so this week, if you've been following along, today we're talking about the Leadership Challenge by blanking on the name.
Kouzes and Posner.
Kouzes and Posner. I probably should have
I'm here
written
for
that.
you, Sam.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's what would this podcast be without you?
It's a monologue, I guess.
Yes. Well, so they cover a pretty broad spectrum,
Yeah.
and I know they have several editions. I read the 4th edition. I think you have the third
so you're
edition,
ahead of
and
me.
I think they're up to 6 now. I think I looked online, and I think there's a 6th edition of this book.
Oh,
So
okay.
I think it's used quite often in text as a textbook.
It is, yeah.
For many universities and business schools. So,
Yeah.
I think any edition would be fine.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever you
It keeps
read.
growing, too. I think they keep getting bigger.
Yeah, well, the 4th edition that I read, they said that they had trimmed it back because it had gotten kind of ballooned, and so the 4th edition trimmed back. But I imagine it's probably expanded again.
Yeah, so I must have gotten one of the third is pretty big book. So.
Yeah. I think the 4th is definitely smaller than the one that you have. But hey, it's all good. So tell us about this book. What's your takeaways on this?
Well, it's called the Leadership Challenge, and I think that's an appropriate term. I think challenge, it has been proven to be for a lot of leaders. I might just say that they've written several other books that kind of have been spawned from the original book.
And they're a very well-known name in the leadership field, son.
And so they read in the several that, for instance, one of the books they wrote afterward is called Credibility. And in their Leadership Challenge book, they have a whole section on credibility. And so then it was so important that they came back with a whole book just on that. They've got another one called Encouraging the Heart. And again, it's a whole book on just how to encourage the heart of your employees. And
which I think was that a whole chapter, I think?
That's a whole section. One of the 5 major things or practices that leaders do. And so, again, there's so much material there that they spawn a whole book. There's another book called A Leader's Legacy, which is, again, just talking about kind of the influence you have long-term over time and a legacy that you leave behind you. And then the last book I've got from them is The Truth About Leadership. And so I've got 5 books altogether from them. And I've read them all. They're all secular books. There's a few things I would take issue with just because they don't take God into account or the Bible necessarily. But if you just want a all-purpose leadership book from a secular perspective that covers a lot of the different things that leaders do.
Yeah,
this is not
I
a
noticed
bad one.
It did cover quite a lot of ground.
Yeah, and I've taught even some Doctor of Ministry seminars and at that level that would use this as a textbook, at least one of the textbooks from a secular perspective. And so certainly not a bad book to be aware of. If you want to just cover a lot of bases with one book,
right,
then the Leadership Challenge certainly is one of those.
Yeah, and so it sort of has it's 5 practices or 5 principles that they talk about. Why don't we just dive into those, and if you can break those down for us.
And some of these, of course, we could go pretty deep into, but
they obviously did because
they've got whole books about it.
Yeah, they've spawned off entire books.
A couple of the 5 practices that they would say a leader does. First one is they would say they model the way. In other words, you don't just talk about what you want people to do. You've got to model it. Your greatest influence is going to be your example.
Right.
So if you want to create a culture of humility, you're going to have to model humility. If you're going to want everyone to be honest and authentic, you've got to do that. And so It's amazing how many times leaders want to behave one way, but they want all their people to behave a different way.
Yeah, what does that do? As I say, not as I do?
Yeah, and because, well, I'm up in the top office, so it's different for me. But you folks on the shop floor, you need to behave this way. So model the way. The second one is inspire a shared vision. And we can talk a lot about that, but they talk quite a bit about vision. And the fact you have to inspire it. As a leader, you've got to be inspirational in one sense. And of course, not everybody gives inspirational kinds of speeches. They're not all charismatic. But there's a lot of ways in which a vision can inspire people, whether you're a great storyteller or whatever else.
And charisma isn't the only way to inspire people either.
Yeah, and even charisma, there's different ways to have it.
Right.
Some people just exude personality and charm, and they enter a room and everybody notices them. But there's other ways where just as you get to know someone, you just become very trusting and loyal to them, and it's they call it a shared vision, which means it can't just be the leader's vision. If it's not shared, then it's never going to take the organization very far. And they make a couple of interesting comments. Now, one thing that they would say about vision that would you might challenge from a Christian perspective is that they say that vision must come from within. Of course, they're not counting on God on this, so they're not expecting God to give a vision or a revelation. This would be a classic kind of secular approach to vision, which would say that the leader basically needs to come up with the vision. And then the leader needs to communicate the vision, and the leader needs to get people to buy into it. And so if you want to get kind of the classic model for vision, then this book gives it. That would be one point I'd push back on the book to say, as a Christian, it shouldn't come from you. It should come from God. And God will then help you to share it. And it should be shared. People should buy into it, but you can get it from God. Another thing it says is, the third one is, leaders challenge the process. And that's kind of the difference in some ways, I would think, between a manager and a leader. A manager just perfects the process.
Right.
They grease the wheels of the process, but they basically keep doing the process. Mm-hmm. A leader says, is this even the right thing to be doing? Of course, the classic difference in saying managers do the things right and leaders do the right things.
Right.
Leaders ask, is this even the right thing anymore? Maybe it was 5 years ago, but is it still the right thing to do? And so leaders are the ones that have to go around saying, I know we've done it that way for a long time, but is that really effective anymore? And of course, that takes a lot of courage. It's just easier just to keep doing the same things, even if you're getting diminishing results. The authors say leaders are pioneers. And he says they have to be willing to explore new territory. Otherwise, in time, with so much change taking place, you're going to end up getting left behind.
Yeah, I like what I think they talk about that, and in that part of the book, the people you're leading are looking at the day-to-day stuff, but you're having to look as a leader. You can't look at tomorrow. You're supposed to be looking 1, 5, 10 years into the future and trying to figure out what is the organization going to look like then, not just this quarter or next quarter.
Yeah, otherwise, your organization is perfectly equipped to do the tasks of yesterday, but not of today or tomorrow. And so, that's why you've got to pull yourself away from some of the daily grind to look a little bit farther afield and to say, we're very, so for instance, if you're making horse and buggy carriages, you can be doing it really well, but when those motor cars start driving down the road, you could be the best people yet at horse-drawn carriages, but that efficiency in building those is going to become obsolete when now there's a new trend coming fast and furious. So you challenge the process. Fourth, you enable others to act, which is a large part of leadership. It's multiplying yourself. Leadership is not about, again, how much you get done, but how much you enable others to do. And so great leaders are people who get the resources, the supplies, the training, the education, whatever is required to enable your people to get the job done. Great leaders, great generals were known for supplying their troops well so they could fight well, they could march well. If you're undersupplied, then it doesn't matter how great your vision is. You're not going to get the job done.
I think you mentioned this in a previous podcast, but leaders should be multiplying and not adding.
Yeah.
And I think that's really speaks to if you enable the people that are following you, that has a multiplying effect, not just adding.
Yeah. And of course, people want to work with someone who's going to enable them to be successful.
Yeah. That's exciting. I mean, that's energizing.
Yeah.
To work for someone who enables you to do what it is that you've been put there to do, whatever your job is, or
it's one thing to be given really high demands. Hey, I need all this performance and these results from you. Now go get it done. But you don't have the resources, the personnel, the budget, the training. But when the boss comes and says, look, what will it take? What do you need to get this job done?
Which I feel like that's something that I think a lot of leaders struggle with. Yeah. I think that's, I would say, one of the hardest things to do, because that requires that letting go of processes and letting go of stuff and allowing your people to actually do the stuff. And that can be scary as a leader, I think.
Yeah, and I think sometimes leaders are just in such a hurry to move on and get the results that they're not willing to wade into the details of, let's figure out what it will take. Let's stay with this long enough to make sure that everything's in place. And the last one, the fifth one, is encourage the heart. And this is kind of an interesting one. Of course, there's a whole book that they wrote subsequently called Encouraging the Heart, and
which on the face sounds kind of soft.
Yeah, it does.
In the leadership.
Like, this is a secular book. In fact, even later in this Leadership Challenge book, they'll wrap it up by talking about the most important quality, perhaps, of a leader is to love their people and to love their work. And you think, wait a minute, this is a secular book? I thought that this sounds like a Christian book. Yeah. And which is interesting, because before that they say it's crucial also for leaders to have humility. And I always kind of laugh, because so much of what is seen as secular books, when secular people discover, when they discover cutting edge new leadership techniques, like you need to have integrity, or you need to love your people. It's like, wow, this is cutting edge. This is rocket science now. Yeah. But you realize, well, the Bible was saying that 2,000 or more years ago. And so often what happens with some of these secular books is that they discover what the Bible has been saying for a long time. Yeah. And that's partly why you can still benefit from a lot of secular books, because a lot of their best points that they make are coming, really, they're just biblical principles. And so when they talk about encouraging the heart, they're saying, and again, from a secular perspective, if you are not speaking right to the soul, to the heart of your people, and helping meet their need, and one of the things that they say is that there's a deep need within people to be a part of something bigger than themselves, to be doing something of significance with their life. And so to encourage the heart means make it more than they're just punching a time clock, but they're actually engaged in something that speaks to their heart, to their personal needs as a human being, to not just be killing 8 hours every day simply for a paycheck, but to be appreciated, to be thanked, even to be loved and by the people that they work with. And so those are the 5 key things and the 5 sections in which this book is kind of built around.
Well, good. Well, let's break here, and then we'll wrap up.
Twice a year, Blackaby Ministries hosts a spiritual leadership coaching workshop in the Atlanta area. The focus of this workshop is learning how to ask the right questions to help move people onto God's agenda. The next workshop is May 6th through 8th, and registration is now open. The early bird rate is available until April 1st, and space is limited. To find out more and to register, visit blackabycoaching.org. Links will be in the show notes.
So, Richard, you touched on this before the break, but these guys have done extensive surveys. They've been studying leadership for quite a long time, and they surveyed a lot of workers and asked them what characteristic do they look for in a leader, and what was the main characteristic that kept coming up?
Well, it was interesting, because they have surveyed thousands of people who serve under various leaders in various industries and businesses, and they said they listed 5 characteristics that came up the most. The fifth one was that the leader's inspiring. They inspire people to follow. The fourth one is that the leaders are competent. They're good at what they do. Third one is they're forward-looking. In other words, they're visionary. You know what? I think I've got 4 here. So, all right. So the first one is that they're honest. And interestingly, that honesty always comes out as number one. And so the followers have said, if I can't trust what my leader's saying, if I don't trust what they're doing, I can't follow them. And so honesty, authenticity, that's really where they kind of pull out their whole book on credibility. They would say, you got to be credible. And interestingly, they also say that if you lose your credibility, if you do something that, you sacrifice your integrity, that they said it's pretty well impossible to get that credibility back. It's something that's hard earned and easily lost. And so to value that credibility, and if people aren't following you, I've had leaders all the time say, well, I'm doing all this, but people aren't following me. One of the first questions I would want to ask is, well, how credible are you? And you may think you're credible, but the results of your followers seems to indicate that they don't seem to think so, because they don't seem all that eager to follow you. So don't assume it's all on them. If no one wants to follow you, it may be that when people look at you, they don't see anything that it compels them and inspires them to follow. And so that honesty is a key one.
Yeah.
Now, there's just a number of other things that they say. A couple of things that I'm just toss a few things out. This is like a 400-page book, and so
could you just condense that down?
Yeah, can we just kind of?
I don't want to have to take the time to actually read it.
For those of you who don't want to take all the time to read it, a couple of things I tossed out. The one thing, by the way, they're big on stories.
Yeah.
In fact, I may have cited this before, but they said there are actually studies done of trying to communicate information, and they actually brought in a group of engineers, and they just talked to them, just told them information, and then they brought in the same group, and they showed PowerPoints with PowerPoint slides, and the third one was they told stories. And then they came back to this group, and they tried to find out how much of that information was remembered, that they could recall. And hands down, the people who use stories, their information was remembered better than PowerPoints or just talking and giving data. And this was to an audience of engineers that you would think were kind of data savvy and
data-centric.
And so, but they said even engineers prefer stories. And not just prefer them, but they remember them. They can recall the information from a story. Yeah. So I thought that was very, very interesting that they would highlight the power of storytelling as a leadership tool. And so there's...
and I think a cool thing that they mention is it's not just storytelling for a better future or for a vision, but it's even storytelling to sort of enable adoption of core principles of your business. If you incorporate stories into every aspect of what it is you want your people to be like or do, then that has a much higher return than just saying, hey, here's a note card with who we are and what we do.
And I think a great leader, there's a story attached to most every value of an organization.
Right.
If you think these are 5 things are organization values, there ought to be a story attached to every one that symbolizes that. And so they would say, stories are so memorable. So if you say that, being a team player is important, and then you've got a great story about how someone sacrificed their own personal desire to be part of a team, and then everybody remembers that, and it can all rehearse that or tell it. They say several things that are interesting. They said, for instance, you need to be good at celebrating. And they said, in fact, at least once a year, you need to be celebrating stuff, because celebrations kind of mark beginnings and endings, and they give some kind of context. And of course, it goes back to encouraging the heart as well, to say that leaders need to be really good at celebrating victories and successes, and celebrating people, affirming people. They say, the interesting thing, they said a leader's job is to keep the projector focused. I've always liked that phrase.
Yeah.
They're saying that the leader gets to control the projector. In other words, you determine where people focus, where they're looking. And so what you put up on the, you shine up onto the screen, it determines now what the discussion is about, what the focus is on. So if you can get people to focus on the right things, they'll start talking about the right things, thinking about the right things, and aiming at the right things. And so you make sure, but you can also get hijacked pretty easily. And so, for instance, I tell leaders all the time, don't let your critics hijack your leadership.
Yeah.
And what happens a lot of times is that the leader has a vision of where they need to go, but then they get attacked. And all of a sudden, they're more focused on their critics and what they're saying and trying to defend themselves and answer their critics and to offer rebuttals. And all of a sudden, they're not keeping the projector focused anymore. Now the critics have taken over the agenda, and you're not talking about the right things anymore. So I thought that was a good one. They said leaders animate the vision and make manifest the purpose so that others can see it, hear it, taste it, touch it, and feel it. In other words, you can't just tell a vision statement once. You can't just even appeal just to one of their senses. You want them to see the vision. You want to hear it. You want them to taste it. You want them it to be real to them, to touch it, to feel it.
And I think that goes back to when they talk about celebrating. I think they even used one of the stories they had was, I think, like some sort of stuffed animal or like a stuffed giraffe that get passed around the office, to recognize, exemplary work of each team member. And so that was even just a physical sort of tactile way to say, we're going in the right direction. And
and it's amazing how creative you can be. But to lodge it into somebody's memory.
Yeah, it's those things that they kept saying. It sounds silly, but this stuff actually works. Yeah, it's with people and with grown adults sometimes. It's the things you do. They say that leaders are always strive to be positive, and they go into a great section on just using words wisely. For instance, don't say "I'll try," but "I will." I won't try to listen more to the grassroots concerns. I will. Use words that are definitive, that are positive, that don't leave you loopholes, that have power to them. Some words are just wishy-washy. Some words are just really bland. And if you're not careful, if you just keep using bland words all the time, you become a bland leader. Use words that have impact. There's different things. They make a great statement in saying success breeds failure. Failure breeds success. And we've talked about that before. Success can be the most dangerous things for leaders. Yeah.
It creates pride and hubris.
Well, what do you think is, because we also say that, small wins sort of generate bigger wins.
Yeah.
So there's sort of this, and I've heard both, and I agree with both takes on it, but how do you sort of justify both of those?
Yeah, well, because you can say, well, you learn from failure. Well, that doesn't mean you just want a whole string of failures.
Well, sure, yeah.
If you just keep failing all the time, you might be a well-educated, unemployed leader. But so you've got to have successes. It's just you got to learn how to handle those successes well.
Right.
And you certainly can unpack and learn from successes as well. A series of small wins creates momentum, and momentum is just invaluable.
Yeah.
Once you've got momentum going, it's amazing how many things start falling into place. Good team members want to jump on board now, and new opportunities come your way, and people start to see that you're on the rise. So you want that momentum, and you gain so much credibility as a leader with a string of successes. Just be careful with those, because with a string of successes can lead to failure if you don't handle them right. One or two last things just to mention before we're out of time. They have an interesting phrase about eliminate the dumb things. And they would just say that, in any kind of organization, things start just creeping in that are just, they're dumb. I would say they just, they're harmful, but no one thinks about them. It's just the way it's been done, or it's just carelessness. No one has addressed them, or maybe it's embarrassing even to point this out at this point. Don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. So we just let stuff go. And in time, culture gets kind of permeated with some dumb things that just need to be eradicated. But leaders are the ones who'll say that. Leaders are the ones who have the authority and the credibility to say, "Hey, why are we doing this? This is crazy. No one likes this. This isn't fruitful or effective." And one other thing, just to say, I thought was interesting, is they talk about some myths that are leadership myths that people assume but are not necessarily true. And one of the myths that they talk about is the fact that it's common practice to say you shouldn't get close to your associates. You shouldn't become friends with the people you work with. Yeah. That you need to keep a professional distance and so on, that you can become compromised, or you don't ever appear like you're playing favorites, or, you need to keep a professional sort of sterile kind of relationship with the people. But, they make a good point, which I've always agreed with. You can't love people and not get close to them. Yeah. I know pastors who practice that, pastors who try not to get too close to their people. And I'd like, well, how can you love people? How could you lay your life down for people and yet not be close to them? Yeah. You can't love somebody and not be close to them. You can't love people and not enjoy being around them, and to share yourself with them and care about them and show interest in them. And likewise, then let them in on your life. You have to obviously have some wisdom with that. But I love the fact that they say that's just a myth. And this is a secular book. It's not a Christian book. They're just saying good leadership that gets great results typically happens when leaders actually care about their people and get close to them. And that's when people become loyal. That's when they share honestly. That's when they trust you, that they can take risks and follow their instincts and sometimes experience failure, and yet know that you care about them, and that they trust you with that. So lots of good points that they bring out in this book. As I said, it's written to be a textbook, so they try to cover the waterfront. Some of these other books narrow in on just one topic, but if you're looking for just kind of an overall secular book on leadership that pretty well covers all the major leadership bases, then certainly this is a great book for that. And I think if you just are trying to catch up on some leadership reading, this will introduce you to a lot of the topics that generally get addressed all the time.
Yeah, definitely. So, Richard, before we go for our next book review, yes. What shall we read?
Well, there's so many things, so many leadership books.
I know. Well, we have like
it's like which one of my children should I talk about next? But you know what I think we should do? Let's read some Patrick Lencioni. Yeah, he's written several. I've got at least I think 5 of his books, but we'll probably focus in on the 5 dysfunctions of a team. And I'll probably draw on some of his other books too. That's what I typically do with people who've written more than one book. But
yeah, as we've seen.
But Lencioni he's famous for writing kind of leadership parables or stories. Yeah. And so it's a different way of writing, but it's quite effective. He's mastered that, where he tells you a leadership story that pulls out all the leadership issues he wants to address. Yeah. And then at the end of the book, he goes into more formal picking it apart and so on. But it makes it interesting reading, because you're reading an engaging story about a leader who's dealing with real life issues. So pick up Patrick Lencioni, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And we'll look at that one next. And if you see any of his books, I usually just pick up what he's written, and they're typically pretty good and useful. But it's a different leadership style, and you might enjoy it because it kind of puts some fiction into nonfiction in one book and unpacks some great leadership truths.
Well, great.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, review us on Apple Podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. If you have questions or comments, please email us at podcast@blackaby.org.